All roads lead to power, and on this show we're going to break that idea down a little bit. What is power? Who has it? And how do you get it? I'm your host, Jeff Coulard. Welcome to the show.
Is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along on the fuel of fear and anger and frustration and craving and the worship of self. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline.
If people don't learn power, people don't wake up. And if they don't wake up, they get left out.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Powerful. This is the holiday edition. It's December 28th, 2020. We are in between Christmas and New Year's, and I don't know about you, but I'm kind of looking forward to rounding out 2020 and seeing what 2021 has in store for us. It's been a heck of a ride this year, but I've thrilled to be finishing this year and finishing this, I guess, season of the show with Dr. Amanda Aguilera, who is a colleague of mine from the Right Use of Power Institute. She's done a lot of work there. She's also the Senior Director of Mission. Let me just read this so I don't get it wrong. Senior Director of Mission, Culture, and Inclusive Community at Naropa University. And she's also the founder of Restorative Integration, which is a consulting, coaching, training, facilitation firm that focuses on power and equity consciousness and diversity and inclusion and really operationalizing power in relationships. And so we're going to dig into all kinds of stuff tonight, from restorative practice to conflict positivity to her journey with power. I'm sure we'll dig into some of her background and her backstory, but that's enough of me talking. Let's bring Dr. Aguilera onto the show. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here with you.
Yeah, no, and between the holidays, this is a time when you could just be drinking a glass of wine and eating some cheese and watching Netflix, and you're choosing to spend the night with me. So I appreciate that.
No, it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
For sure. And just a reminder for viewers, if you're following along and you're watching live and you have questions or comments for myself or Dr. Aguilera, feel free to just drop them into the comment box in Facebook, and we'll read them as we go on the show. So don't be shy. Let's maybe start with. I gave the brief bio, the 2 lines, but what do you do? What's your primary focus, or like what drives you these days in the different works? I know you do different work in different places, but is there a common thread that ties that together? And if so, maybe what is that? And let's start there.
Yeah, that's a good question. My work in the world is really centered on helping people to understand power. And usually that comes in the context or the package of conflict. So usually there's some sort of interpersonal difficulty that's happening. And that's when we start to begin the conversation about power. Unfortunately, that's not the best time to start talking about power, but that's usually when people come to it. I work at Naropa and Naropa University, and there I am in leadership, doing a lot of different things, bringing together a lot of the wisdom that Naropa uniquely provides. So contemplative education, the Joanna Macy Center, restorative community. So really trying to establish restorative practices there. And then also our JEDI work, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusivity. So it's just a fun thing to do, to bring those things together. But the work itself is not necessarily fun. I always say, why did I choose this profession? Because it is challenging.
Mm-hmm. It's I imagine it's a lot of pushing against the status quo, or it's a lot of upending what has become systematized and structured power dynamics, which we've seen a lot of between Black Lives Matter movement more recently, but I mean over the generations we've seen that power dynamic playing itself out in society and in relationships, like you say, at the interpersonal place. So what brought you to power? Like what was your introduction to this line of work? How'd you fall into it, if you fell into it?
Yeah, so I was working in restorative practices. This was probably 2008, and Um, in restorative practices, I stumbled across Dr. Sita Barstow's work and took a workshop of hers for right use of power. And that's when I started the light bulb went off, like, oh yeah, power. This is everywhere, and this is something we don't talk about, and we don't have a language for. And suddenly, here's a language and here's a framework. So I started working with Dr. Barstow probably within a few months of taking a workshop with her, and helped her to establish the Right Use of Power Institute. And I've been working with her ever since, off and on in different capacities.
Getting drawn into the ecosystem of the Right Use
Yes.
of Power Institute.
Yeah.
Let's maybe, should we start at restorative practices? Because that seems to be where your journey kind of with power or with right use of power started. You were practicing in restorative practices, and I'm familiar a bit with restorative justice practices, having worked in addiction and mental health with young people. You know, restorative practice and restorative stuff was kind of around the edges of our work, but I'm curious about how you would describe restorative practice. Like, what is that for somebody who's watching? Is like, I can put those two words together, but I don't necessarily know exactly what they mean. What do you mean when you say restorative practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of people are familiar with restorative justice. So restorative justice is a type of restorative practice. So restorative practice is kind of like the umbrella. And restorative justice is one type of restorative practice that's used as a responsive, structured, reparative process once harm has happened. But restorative practice as the umbrella has a lot more within that actually helps to build relationships and maintain relationships, not just repair them.
Okay. Can you give me an example? Like, what would a restorative practice be?
Yeah. So, for example, to build relationships, we use things like connection circles, which are really just people sitting in a circle, and a facilitator uses a question that helps people get to know one another. And so everyone has an opportunity to answer that question. It sounds very simple, but it's actually can be used in a variety of different situations in a lot of different environments with people. We don't often take the time to actually develop relationship and to actually build the foundation of relationship. But that's actually the most important part of restorative practices. To reduce the amount of time we have to actually go into a reparative process.
It's like we often skip some important steps of relationship development, and then suddenly we're surprised when there's conflict, and we have to back up and try and figure it out. Yeah, that's interesting. A few colleagues of mine, starting in the summer, started to connect. We're consultants and coaches, and we're kind of in the process of building a company, actually, and we'll be launching it fairly soon, or it's kind of half launched. But we spent a lot of time doing what we call designing the alliance, like designed alliance work, which sounds similar in that relationship building, like slowing that down and really getting to know each other and what we need and what we care about, and like seeing who we are and making sure we design how we want to be with each other. And I'm sure that it's going to pay dividends in the future when we run into some sticking points or tensions. We'll have already talked about some of it, and we'll have designed it in advance. And so I like that aspect of restorative practice. It seems like that's a no-brainer, and that we should be doing way more of that than we are.
Yeah, I agree. But for some reason, and this is why cultural and paradigmatic shifts need to happen, because culturally we don't really support the building up of relationships. I heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice in your intro, and it just reminded me of how much he emphasizes beloved community, and really what that means is a whole, I think, something that could be studied for a long time. Just those two words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been exploring the power of community and the role it plays in our lives, because we live in a pretty individualistic society. I know that even Canada's maybe a little less so than the States. I think the States might stand out as a pretty hyper individualistic. It's you pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, and you succeed or fail on your own merit. Canada might be a little more socialist, a little more left leaning, a little more community minded, but still pretty individual. I think Western culture in general is pretty individualistic, and yet I see the power of community to solve all of our solve the bulk of our problems are solvable in community. And that was an awareness that I had doing addictions treatment for about a dozen years prior to, up to about 2017, when I kind of left addictions treatment. But the community did more of the work than the practitioners did. Like just the fact of bringing kids together. We were working with youth in the woods. It was one of those wilderness therapy programs. And I would often look out a window and see a kid playing with a dog by the lake. And it's like, that's more healing, that moment that they're experiencing in community, than anything else that we could possibly do. And we spent a lot of time sitting around campfires and, sitting around meal tables together, and, that's being encircled together. So that resonates a lot with me.
Yeah. I think the trick is, if we're going to focus on community and relationship, we actually have to have an understanding of power. Otherwise, we're going to just recreate the same systems of oppression over and over again. So while we're trying to repair harm or build relationships, we're just going to keep recreating it. So understanding power and all the different dimensions of power is really critical. And then also offering space for difference and allowing conflict to be present. I define conflict as the presence of different needs, beliefs, expectations, and/or commitments. So if you think about, anyone in your life, you're going to have one of those things, at least one of those things that is different. So if we're allowed to authentically show up as ourselves, then there's going to be conflict, right? So learning, a big part of being in community is learning how to be in conflict, how to be with difference.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you describe your introduction to the right use of powers, like stumbling across it. And I'd be interested in that story. That's like the specifics of that, whether it was, just a conversation you had with somebody or an article or a book or whatever. We totally stumbled into it, or I stumbled into it. One of our therapists, Serena Rose, I don't know if you know Serena. Yeah, so she
not personally, but
she's a RUP trainer, and she came and did like a couple-hour workshop with the staff team, and it was like a light bulb went off. We've been doing addictions treatment for 10 years as a team, and realized that we were, like you say, recreating systems of oppression. We were recreating a lot of the conflict dynamics that were inherent in these young people's lives, and that like a shift went off, or a light bulb went off for us as a team. And that was I can point to that as a turning point for myself professionally and personally, as well as the program. So I wonder how many people stumble. I'd be interested to find how people find their way to power. But let's talk a little bit about power, because that's kind of the underpinning of this show. And a lot of my work and your work is really geared around helping people understand power. So let's dig into it. What is it? You mentioned some of the different dimensions, different kind of types of power. Let's maybe start at the fundamentals. What do people need to know? What's the most helpful for people to know about power that we can introduce them to tonight?
Yeah, what are the most foundational? So I think first, and I don't know how much you've covered this in other shows or yourself, but I think first the most important thing to understand is that power is neutral, because I think a lot of people avoid power or have negative associations with it. But I think we disempower ourselves when we associate power with negative things and avoid it. Yeah, so I think that's the first thing. The second thing is one of the dimensions of power is personal power. And that personal power is something that everyone's born with. And so even my little 4-year-old daughter, Dr. Barstow defines power as the ability to have an effect or influence. So anyone can have an effect or influence. And when we find ourselves in systemic power or institutional power, where we may not have a certain role power or status power, we usually abandon ourselves and we abandon the power that we do have. And we get caught in that dualistic thinking of it's those people have power and these people don't, or I'm powerless. And it's true that, some people have more role or status power in a given situation. But what's interesting to me is that personal power is the thing that kind of mediates all the other types of power. And when people are born with a lot of born with a lot of status power, for example, white people in the West, or pretty much all over the world, are born with a lot of status power. And because they have status power, they usually have the opportunity to get role power also, because of their status power. And so a lot of people who have a lot of status power, like white, cis, heterosexual men, for example, they don't really have to develop personal power, right? Because they're given so much of the other kinds of power. And so what I see is a lot of times people with what we call down status, people who are not born with a lot of status power, actually have to develop their personal power, which is really, that's why it seems like a lot of people of color are actually more powerful, right? Because they develop that personal power.
Yeah, and then it's interesting. So like I slow down a little bit because you threw some terms out there that the listener might be like, what is that? So there's a couple different types of power. So you mentioned personal power off the top, which is kind of the birthright. We're all born with it, and I think oftentimes we'll basically say like it's someone's personality, right? Like, or their motivation, their intrinsic kind of their drive, their charisma, their communication skills, things that are portable from one context to another would be kind of personal power. And there's probably a cluster of characteristics that we could point to and say, like, that is what gives people power, the ability to affect change based on who they are and how they show up in the world. There's role power, which you mentioned, which is pretty straightforward. On tonight's show, I'm the facilitator, you're the guest. And so within that comes some power. I can choose the questions, I can drive the conversation, I can, I can make decisions, I can affect change for you as the guest. So role is, assigned. It's oftentimes draws a salary or has a title attached to it. Status power, you mentioned, and I'd like to maybe pause on status power for a little minute, and before we move on to the next, what is status power, and how would the right use of power kind of framework define status power? And let's talk about that for a minute, because I think that's important.
Absolutely. Thanks for slowing me down. I tend to get very passionate, and
I do too. That's totally just I do the same thing, and so I'm aware of it.
Yeah. So status power is the power that is culturally conferred. It usually accompanies a characteristic that we don't often have a lot of control over. For example, race. What are some other things that don't have control? Gender, sexual orientation, and then there's things like class, which you don't have a lot of control over when you're born into a social class. You can change that over your lifetime. So you get the idea. So religion, a lot of different things. And then I'm about to use another word, so I'm trying to think of how to not use that word. But I mentioned systemic power. The people who have the most role power usually determine who has status power. And that usually gets perpetuated over time. So status power, for example, I mentioned white people have status power in the West and most of the world. Higher class people, higher income, so to speak. And then Christian religion in the West, things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I light up all the boxes. I tick all the boxes for status power in our society, for sure. Heterosexual, cisgendered, white, English-speaking, well-educated male, right? It's like you don't get much more status than that in our society. And so one of the things that's like the blessings for me of right use of power has been my awareness of that, and the impact that can have in relationship is so much greater than it once was. And immediately tangible benefits when I was a addictions practitioner was when I sat down across from like a 16-year-old white kid from the suburbs or a 14-year-old indigenous female from the reserve, like very different power dynamics at play, and I wouldn't have been aware of them previously. And that new awareness, you can make different choices, right? And you can choose to take that, like operationalize that power differently. So you mentioned systemic power, which is, I guess, the frameworks and the structures we put in place in society to perpetuate systems of power. Would that be how you describe it, or how would you describe? Or
Yeah, exactly. So usually people with status power get role power, and then people with role power usually tend to make the rules, write the laws, write the policies, create the institutions, and they create those and write those in their own image, so to speak. So they write it from their own perspective, which is a privileged perspective. And whether consciously or unconsciously, they write those to their own advantage. So to maintain their own power. And so what happens is the same things get perpetuated over and over. But the good news is that there's collective power, which is when people gather their whatever power they do have, personal role and status power that they do have, toward a common interest. And that can, again, it's neutral. So it can take forms like the Ku Klux Klan, and it can take forms like Black Lives Matter. So, but what people don't often think about is, how can I help create more collective power? Right? How can I be a part of collective power? Because a lot of people are too busy thinking that they're powerless.
powerless, or it's all personal power.
Uh-huh.
Right? Like, I think that one thing that I've noticed the most in the journey is that the other types of power the power just gets blended, and we just experience power. So we'll experience someone's power in the role that they have, but we won't necessarily categorize it as role power. We'll personalize it, and we'll say this is obviously this person has this power, as opposed to, there's personal power, but there's also this role power and this status power, and what we're experiencing is all three of those blended together, right? And what I've appreciated most probably about just knowing of the different types is that I can start to distinguish between, like, what is role power here, what is status power, and what is personal power, because otherwise it gets really hard to disentangle our personal identities and our egos from the conversation about, I do a lot of work in leadership, and it's just rife with egos, right? And how do we unpack that, and how do we depersonalize this context that people find themselves in, where the people that they're responsible for or with are responding to their power and not responding to them as a person, right? Like, that's it's an interesting dynamic, and maybe that's where we can go next. Because I know you do a lot of work around conflict, and that's how a lot of people get introduced to ideas of power, is that there's some sort of conflict that they're trying to navigate. Is there anything more you want to mention about power? You mentioned up and down, or you mentioned down power. That's a dynamic that's probably helpful for the listener. Is this
Sure.
up and down power? What do we mean by those?
Yeah. So those are just terms to help us understand the power differential. So a teacher has, we would say, up role power to a student who has down role power. A white person has up status power. A person of color has down status power. And I would just want to mention what's really important is that, again, down power does not mean no power. It just means in that particular relationship, there is a differential which influences the dynamic of the relationship.
And with that differential, particularly with the role differentials, student and teacher, coach and athlete, like, those are pretty clear cut, that there's a role, and within those roles there's expectations, and there's boundaries, or there's things in place. We don't often have the same set of kind of understandings or boundaries when it comes to status power, when it comes to personal power. Role is probably the easiest one to talk about, because it's usually, there's job descriptions associated with your role, right? And you can point to those and say, here's what we're here to do.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, let's talk about conflict. I know you spend a lot of time in conflict. And you mentioned before we jumped on about conflict positivity, which I actually heard you on a podcast, I think with Regina on the Reboot podcast. And you guys were talking a bit about conflict positivity. So I'd love to jump into that, because that's a lot of the work that I end up doing is conflict transformation type work. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on it, as well as kind of how you approach conflict and how we should approach conflict, maybe in groups and in individual relationships. And let's just dive into it. Let's talk about conflict.
Sure. Yeah, so similar to power, I think a lot of us have negative associations with conflict because we're not really taught how to do it. We're not really taught the anatomy of conflict or how to understand it. I grew up thinking that if I'm in conflict, then someone is wrong or bad or something, you know. And so then a lot of shame comes up, and then we avoid it, or we get competitive. So it's like it becomes this, we produce a lot of harm when we're in conflict often. And so in the brain, harm gets associated with conflict. And so naturally we avoid it. So I guess for me, I'm kind of on a mission to help people shift their understanding of conflict and their relationship with conflict. And so being conflict positive simply means that we understand that if we're in relationship, conflict is inevitable. So I define conflict as the presence of different needs, beliefs, expectations, and or commitments. So if you think about it in that way, everyone has different needs, beliefs, expectations, and commitments. So if we're all allowed to show up authentically, then inevitably we're going to be in conflict. So being conflict positive is understanding that this is going to happen. We're going to be in conflict. It doesn't mean that anyone's bad or wrong. And we can actually approach it and have generative outcomes. So if you think about a time when you had conflict and you worked through it, you stuck with it, and at the end, what happened?
You end up being closer. You end up having a deeper understanding of the other person's needs, wants, expectations.
So greater intimacy, greater trust, right? If we know how to engage with it, we can actually produce that.
So how do you engage with it? How do you help people shift their perspective? Or where do you start with that conversation?
I guess it depends on the person and the conflict. I do a lot of, if you can't tell already, I do a lot of teaching while I talk, and coaching and reframing and things like that. And I ask a lot of questions. I created a worksheet called a self-reflection worksheet that I give to people before they even engage in a like a restorative conversation or a conflict resolution process. And that worksheet asks some really important questions that helps people to shift into a different space. So for example, the very first question is, why is this relationship important to you? Dr. Barstow says feedback is an investment in relationship. Well, engaging in conflict is also an investment in relationship. If this relationship is not important with you and to you, then you don't need to engage in it. But even if it's, I have to work with this person, right? You're identifying why it's worthwhile to actually take the time to engage with this. And that's kind of putting it forefront in your mind. And then it walks through, there's like, I don't know, 13 questions or something. I won't go through all of them, but it walks you through different things like talk about what you observed and then talk about your story about what happened. So really trying to separate your assumptions and beliefs with what actually happened. Identifying feelings and then identifying the needs that are associated with those feelings is also another thing. What do you want to get out of this, right? These are all things. And then the very last question is, what's most important to you? And keeping that forefront in your mind. Because a lot of people engage in conflict and forget about what's important and get caught up in being right, or getting caught up in the nitpicky details. For example, I went through a divorce, and we did mediation, and I brought a picture of my daughter and I put it between us so that we wouldn't get caught up in the, just to remember what was most important. So those are some things.
As we were talking, I heard maybe some work of Marshall Rosenberg's work around compassionate nonviolent communication. I heard
Yes.
observations, feelings, and needs in there, and
Absolutely.
I'm sure you help people get to requests as well. That's like, speaking of models and frameworks when it comes to this work, that paired with the right use of power has been the two kind of pieces of work that I lean on the most in my work, for sure. And actually, a total side story, and I might have told this on the podcast before, but it doesn't matter. Like, we came to compassionate communication or nonviolent communication, Rosenberg's work, totally, again, accidentally, which is probably how the best discoveries get made, is when we hired a youth worker named Patricia, and she came to camp, and she was very well versed in NVC, and she started to teach the young people that she was working with, like, one-on-one, this framework: observation, feeling, need, request. Less like go through the loop. And I was listening in on a conversation that a kid was having with his mom, and I was listening to him talk, and I was like, who is this kid, and where did he learn how to talk like that? Because I thought he was a staff member. He was calm, and he was eloquent, and he was very clearly articulating his feelings and his needs, and he was reframing her feelings and needs for her. And I was like, wow, this is powerful stuff. And so I can see how it would form up the basis of some of the work that you do around helping people get beneath conflict, because I think it's Rosenberg who said conflict is just a tragic expression of unmet needs.
That's right.
And when we can get to those needs, then we can usually realize that we have shared needs. And so your example of bringing the picture of your daughter into mediation is like, here's our shared need. Here's the thing that we care about the most, and let's center that in the conversation. So I love that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love that work. And it really is about learning new languages, in a new framework for understanding what's happening.
Yeah, that's what it seems to be with both of those frameworks for myself, and I know colleagues of mine. They're just languages that help unlock a different level of understanding of what's actually happening, getting us away from, maybe, like you say, the nitpicky details or the being right. I know that desire to be right has probably caused me more stress and anxiety and conflict than lots of other things. So that's so how do you? So I guess you get people to reflect on some of those pieces. What happens? I'm interested in conflict in groups, and I imagine you've done some kind of group mediation. And where do you want to go first? Because I'm curious. I want to talk to you about your research, your doctoral research around shame and power and the justice system. And I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into this conflict positivity conversation.
Well, they're somewhat tied together. I think that, so I wrote my dissertation on, another part of my background is I have a doctorate of psychology. I've been a therapist for many years, and really got interested in shame and started studying Brene Brown before she was cool, before she got famous. I think even before her first, famous book was published. And, really understanding how shame interrupts our relationship with ourselves and with other people. And then applying that to the justice system and what is happening in the justice system. And then weaving in the dynamics of power. So it was the dynamics of shame and power in the justice system. And what I came to realize is that the way that we engage with people when they're in conflict, or they've caused harm, or they've been a victim of harm. The way we engage with them can either leave them empowered or disempowered, right? And often, we wonder why the recidivism rate or the reoffense rate is so high in the United States. It's been hovering around 70% for a long time, which is just, for decades. And
how is that? Or how has that not been fixed? Like, that seems like that'd be a pretty big red flag. Maybe that's a total side trail we would have to go down. But I'm like, I think about that, and I'm like, well, why is that? And how does society allow for that? I guess would be a question that I have. Which that's a big. We could talk all night about that, but
we could. But I think there are pieces that are related to this conversation. Which one is the justice system has been in place this way. We've been treating people who've done wrong this way for a long time. We shame them. We shame them and we punish them. And so when we shame and we punish, we actually disempower. And so there's this whole loop. I created this whole theoretical model. I can send it to you if you want, but this whole theoretical model that shows how it's like a cycle, right? That just gets re-perpetuated. And until we shift into a different paradigm about how we understand conflict, how we understand harm, and why people engage in harm, we're going to keep doing that. So I think restorative practices is a big key, and restorative justice has been present in the justice system, but a lot of times when you put restorative justice inside a system that doesn't allow for the principles to exist, then restorative justice gets perverted, and it gets used as another form of shaming or punishing. So I guess it's to say that we really have to. Have you heard of double loop learning? Yeah. So single loop learning is changing your actions to get a different result. That's single loop learning. Okay, I'm going to try a different behavior to get a different result. And we do that over and over again. But double loop learning is, what are the assumptions or the basic beliefs that lead us to act in a certain way that get certain results? So we actually go back to the assumptions and the values and the beliefs. And that's what we have to do in the justice system. Well, in our culture in general, but we have to kind of examine those and see how those are impacting the results.
Yeah, it seems like any practice, when it gets decoupled from the principles that are behind it or that originated that practice, are at risk of being perverted by the system that they just get, I've seen that in addictions treatment over and over and over again. This patient-centered, this person-centered care has its roots in human-centeredness, which is great, right? And if you go back to the principles of it, it's super effective, right? But patient-centeredness in the healthcare system means something entirely different, and it's been bastardized and adjusted to meet the needs of that system. So, we could go off on a tangent about that. We could take lots of side trails today. Right? So what shame and the justice system, what were some of your biggest findings, besides the fact that it's, these are systemic problems, not more than anything, and that these are rooted in probably some of society's beliefs and assumptions about what's effective at deterring people from criminal activity or from, what were some of your other, what were some of the findings, and was there anything kind of surprising that you found in your research, or
over and over and over, what I found is relationships, strong relationships are associated with lower recidivism. Autonomy and things that were empowering for the offender are associated with lower recidivism. On self-evaluative emotions, guilt is associated with lower recidivism, but shame is associated with higher recidivism. So
let's talk about those two, because I think they probably get conflated or confused with each other often in conversation, guilt and shame.
Yeah.
What's the difference, and why does that difference matter?
Yeah. Well, Brene Brown talks about guilt is I did something bad, and shame is I am bad. So shame basically globalizes something that we've said or done that may have caused harm. And we globalize it either for ourselves or other people into our entire identity. And the problem with that is when you've done something wrong and it's a behavior that you're saying that behavior actually caused harm, it's easier to change a behavior than it is an identity, right? And there's so many kids who get institutionalized, who get labeled as a bad kid, and our justice system is set up so our criminal record follows you for the rest of your life. How are you supposed to um, uh, think of yourself as a good person if you're constantly told that you're bad? And if you're constantly told that you're bad, your assumptions and your beliefs are going to impact your actions, which are going to impact the result. So, you know, it comes back to, and it's very hard. I've worked in the justice system, and I actually intentionally worked in every part of the justice system and I got my doctorate because someone once told me, oh, restorative justice, you just don't understand the realities of these people. You just don't get it. So I got my doctorate of psychology and focused on criminology. I worked with police. I worked with inmates. I worked as a probation officer, and I worked with judges. And I worked in reentry also, doing groups and things. So I worked in every part of the justice system, and it's not easy. It's very, very difficult work. Um, but the work that I did in that system, and when I focused on relationships, um, it's just amazing the shifts that can happen, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't have to sell me on the value of relationship. That was another of those realizations that we had in addictions treatment, and that's my background. Like the bulk of my background is addiction, kind of mental health with young people and families, and we basically at some point just threw out the binder full of psychoeducational groups about drugs and like why drugs are bad, and just doubled down on building relationship and giving autonomy and fostering a sense of belonging and connection. And that's, for me, I think when I think of power, and you talk about how we use our power will either, lead to shame for people or not, and lead to connection and empowerment and disempowerment. And I got to that place of like, it's either we're connecting as humans or we're disconnecting, right? And if we're disconnecting, we're going to get predictable results. Like all of these things, all of these conflicts, like when you talk about conflict positivity and you talk about restorative practice of being this front end, let's intentionally design these relationships and deepen these relationships because we know what's coming, right? We know that conflict is coming. And I think that's the one, multiple benefits from right use of power from my perspective, but one of them has been realizing how predictable power dynamics are and how predictable what happens inside of a power dynamic can actually be. And if it's predictable, then we can plan for it and we can be intentional around how we navigate it. So how has right use of power impacted your work the most, maybe at a personal level, either your work as a senior director at Naropa, or as a parent? You have a 4-year-old. I have some young people in my life, and I know it's impacted my parenting, I'm sure. But what are some of the ways in which right use of power has most profoundly impacted your practice?
I would say at every level and every part of my life. And when I do workshops and training, when I get feedback, even some time after I give the training, people say, you totally changed how I see the world in relationships, because it does. It gives you a different way of understanding what's happening. And so it gives you choice. Now I can see what's happening here, and now I can choose how I use my power. Right. And one of the most impactful things, I think, is learning the difference between intention and impact, because I think a lot of good people, I'm a good liberal white person. And so I have really good intentions. That means I can't possibly have a negative impact. I can't possibly be racist because I view myself as not racist. And then we get feedback that, oh, maybe that thing that I said was racist. And so there's all sorts of psychological things that are happening, cognitive dissonance and all sorts of things. But understanding the difference between my intention could have been good, but the fact that the impact was different than that means that I have something to learn, right? And if someone is generous enough to give me that feedback, to let me know how I impacted them, especially when I know from the research on the brain. So Dr. Keltner, I don't know if you've read much of his research. Dr. Keltner did decades of research, MRI studies on the brain for people in the power differential. So people who have up power and people who have down power. And it's fascinating what happens in the brain just with the presence of a power differential. And I know from that when I'm in up power, there are things that I literally cannot see. I am ignorant of them. I literally cannot see them.
And I think that's an interesting phenomenon and an interesting realization, is that we are most aware of power when we don't have it, right? When we're in that down power position, we're pretty acutely aware of the fact, because a lot of our energy and effort is spent in protective mode or in trying to get our needs met, or, that versus being in a position where you don't have to think twice about getting your needs met, right? And you can affect change just by being who you are, right? And you don't have to be aware of power. And I think that lack of awareness of power within the groups of people that have that power, right? That's the most dangerous combination, right? Is ignorance, like power and ignorance together. I think leads to a lot of negative outcomes. Backing up to Keltner's research, is that the research that was? I remember reading some a while ago about empathy in CEOs and chief executive officers when they were doing MRIs. Was that his work or somebody else's?
Probably.
Yeah. Okay.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's harder to have empathy. Basically, as soon as we get that role power, or as soon as we get power, Dr. Keltner says, once you get to that power, you use your personal power to get into leadership positions. And then once you get into the leadership position, there's something literally that happens in the brain that turns off the functions of empathy, that turns off the functions. And some of that is necessary, right? Sometimes we have to make decisions for the whole. And so if we're caught up with being empathetic to one person, then we are incapable of making decisions for the whole sometimes. But for people especially who are only in leadership positions, sometimes I do workshops and there are some older white men who say, I'm never in a down power position. And my recommendation is always go do something where you're totally ignorant of it. You're totally new, where you know nothing about it. Be a student, pick a hobby so that you have the experience of that to actually balance out your brain, because it kind of develops in that way. And we get further and further away from things like empathy, which is really dangerous.
Well, it makes it more and more challenging to be in right relationship with people if we can't empathize with them. There's a lot of interesting research around trust and what factors drive trust in relationship, and intimacy, which is empathy and discretion, is the number one driving force for interpersonal trust, right?
Yes.
And ego, right? Low ego, high empathy, right? And that's usually the opposite that we see in leadership positions of, we find people with big egos and not a lot of empathy. So it's no wonder we don't trust a lot of our leaders these days. There seems to be a bit of a crisis of trust and faith in some of our institutions and our leaders of those institutions, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. You mentioned Brene Brown as an influence, and I think it's hard to, you can't throw a stick these days without hitting a Brene Brown podcast or a book. She's everywhere, and that's great.
Yeah.
And obviously, Dr. Cedar Barstow's work has been influential for you. Who else comes to mind when you think of books, or specific authors or books that they've written, podcasts, things that anyone who's listening to this show, if they want to dig in a little bit more into some of these topics, particularly restorative practice? I think I can probably give a pretty good list for the power dynamic stuff. But when it comes to restorative, is there a body of work or an author that you'd recommend people check out?
There's one of my passions is reading, so there's so many. So in restorative practices, I'm looking at my bookshelf. Restorative practices. So Howard Zehr is kind of the grandfather of restorative justice. I really like, so Howard Zehr, Beverly Title was one of my mentors. She has a book. Let's see. Trying to think for restorative practices. I've been reading so many different books. Right now, my current influences are Joanna Macy and her work on. I'm actually reading a book she wrote a long time ago based on her dissertation. Ruth King, Mindful of Race. This is a good one that I've read recently. Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, Zenju Earthland Manuel. Gosh.
If it's easy, maybe I'll get you to send me a list.
I can send you a
list. I can
Yeah.
load them up into the show notes, so anybody who's listening or watching will have a good recommended reads from Dr. Aguilera for all of these topics, along with the show notes. So where can people find you? Is restorativeintegration.com the best place for people to learn more about your work? And I know you've got some resources up, some courses, probably free and paid, and some opportunities to engage you and your team.
Absolutely. Yeah. Restorativeintegration.com. We have just built an online community that's free to join, so you can go ahead and sign up. The courses will be released, I think, January 5th. So there are several introductory courses that are free. So Introduction to Restorative Practices, if you want to learn more about that, Introduction to Right Use of Power, all of these are free. And then there's a Power and Equity Challenge that we're starting fairly soon, and the intro to that will also be free. The Power and Equity Challenge is kind of a year-long exploration into all the things that we've been talking about tonight.
Awesome. And I will let viewers know that it is at least a year's worth of work, if not a lifetime. I'm sure it's a lifetime's worth of work, this journey with the right use of power. Let's end the show. I don't want to keep it too long on a Monday night between the holidays. I'm sure you've got something to do. Power and equity consciousness is something that we talked about before we hopped on, and I want to just give a bit of time for you to describe what that is and why it's important, and like what the genesis is, because I know it's something that kind of came to you, and you've been working towards kind of figuring out what that consciousness is and how we can cultivate it in ourselves. So maybe we'll round out the show on that note, and you can fill us in on what do you mean by power and equity consciousness, and why is it important?
Yeah. So power and equity consciousness is a term that I came up with in conversation with my colleague Regina Smith, who, that term came to me because I was trying to find something to refer to what it is that I'm trying to help people to develop. And I heard of this term race consciousness, which I think is really critical and should be centered and should be developed. And yet there's this whole other dimension of power that also, once you understand how all the different dimensions of power work, you start to develop this consciousness, as we've been talking about. You start to see things differently, and you have more choice. So I also came up with it because a lot of times I think, using terms like woke or something puts us into this, either or, us versus them, again, that dualistic frame. So developing power and equity consciousness allows us to have a bigger conversation.
I love it, and I'm gonna have to have a further chat with you. I'll be on the show again, and we'll dig into some more of that, because I think that dualistic thinking, that very black and white, this or that, us or them, is like that polarization. I mean, we certainly see it in our politics, but we see it everywhere. We see it in our social media. We see it I see it in myself.
Yes.
My tendency towards dualistic, like, because it's easy. So at some level, it's easier, right? It's less demanding for us to live in the black and white than it is to realize that we live in a very gray world where and we're always at the intersection of a bunch of different factors and forces, all different types of power. So I love that term, and I love the work that you're doing, and thank you for the work that you're doing, for sure.
Yeah.
And thank you for your time tonight. Is there any kind of last requests that you'd like to make of either myself or the audience for something that you'd like us to do, a question maybe to reflect on to round out 2020 or to start our new year?
Yeah, my question is, if you were to center relationship in your life, instead of being right, instead of proving your point, instead of whatever else, if you were to actually center relationship, what would shift for you?
Awesome. That is a wonderful way to round out this year and this show. So thank you very much, Dr. Aguilera. It's a pleasure to chat with you. And
Thank you
I'm
so
sure
much
we'll
for
be
having me.
chatting again soon. All right. Take care.
Right. Thanks.